A racist white woman smashed Big Shaq's sports car in broad daylight. But that was only the beginning. She thought her lies would win. She didn't count on cameras or the truth catching fire. When the story hit the headlines, the whole country took sides. What happened? No one saw it coming, and it changed everything. The sun dipped low over the manicured rooftops of White Willow Lane, throwing warm amber shadows across the gated community's pristine sidewalks. It was the kind of place where every lawn was mowed at the same angle, every porch light clicked on at the exact same hour, and every neighbor wore a smile that didn't always reach their eyes. Order wasn't just preferred here. It was enforced. When the matte black Escalade pulled up to Lot 17, a hush seemed to ripple through the cul-de-sac. The vehicle's windows were tinted too dark to see through, the hum of its engine too smooth to belong to anything less than luxury. The moving trucks had come earlier in the week, but this was the moment the neighborhood had waited for. The new homeowner was arriving. The door opened, and out stepped a man who didn't belong, not according to the unspoken rules of the street. Big Shaquille. Shaq Hawkins, NBA legend. Business mogul. A walking 6'11" statement in tailored gray joggers, and a charcoal polo that clung to his sculpted frame like it had been made for him. Because it had. His presence shifted the air. Not because he wanted it to. Just because it did. From behind the curtain of 18 White Willow, a pair of eyes squinted through a sliver in the blinds. Karen Wexler Caldwell, 47, chair of the HOA and self-appointed cultural gatekeeper of the block. She pursed her lips just tight enough to show restraint, her manicured fingers twitching slightly against the lace of the curtain. "He's even taller in person," she muttered under her breath, like the observation would somehow diminish his place on her street. Across the road, a sprinkler ticked in slow arcs. 2 houses down, a neighbor lingered too long by their mailbox, pretending to look for something that hadn't arrived. Another's dog barked once, fell silent. There was no welcome committee, just the dry static hum of judgment humming through an invisible web of gossip. Shaq didn't flinch. He lifted his aviators, hung them on the collar of his shirt, and surveyed his new home with the steady calm of a man who had built his life inch by inch, and was done apologizing for the view. The house was modern glass and wood, a minimalist palace framed by black steel gates, and a perfectly squared hedgeline. It didn't just fit in, it elevated the whole street, but that didn't matter here. What mattered was that he had bought it. Shaq took the concrete path to the front door, with slow, deliberate steps. The wind rustled the leaves above him, but the street stayed quiet. He reached the door, punched in the code himself, no assistant, no entourage, just him, and stepped inside without looking back. Karen let the curtain fall, her face neutral, but her chest tight. She turned to her husband, Russell, who sat at the kitchen island, sipping from a tumbler of scotch. "He's here." Russell looked up, barely interested. "The basketball guy?" Karen nodded, folding her arms. "They always come in flashy." "Let it go, Karen." But she wouldn't. She never did. Inside Shaq's house, sunlight spilled across polished floors and high ceilings. He paused in the foyer, taking in the silence. Not the kind from isolation, the kind from arrival. This wasn't just a move. This was a reclamation. Every home he'd ever owned had been earned. Sweat, grind, court lights, and boardroom battles. This one, more than most, felt like a line in the sand, a place he'd stay. The next day, the mailman avoided eye contact as he handed over a small stack of official-looking letters. A soft welcome scribbled on one envelope from someone who hadn't signed their name. Shaq gave him a nod. Not too friendly, not cold, just enough. Later, as he adjusted the heavy custom weights in his garage gym, a shadow loomed in the driveway. Karen. Her sweater was pristine ivory, her smile tighter than it had any right to be. "Mr. Hawkins," she said sweetly, clasping her hands like a preacher's wife. "I just wanted to welcome you to the neighborhood." Shaq turned down the music. Not off, just lower. "Appreciate it," he said, standing up fully, his frame dwarfing hers without effort. She shifted. "We have a few guidelines in White Willow. Nothing too restrictive, just standards." Shaq arched one brow. Karen continued. "Yard maintenance, parking schedules, noise levels after sundown. Oh, and community aesthetic is important to us. We try to maintain a certain harmony." "Harmony," Shaq repeated slowly, the words sitting heavy between them. Karen smiled wider. "Exactly. I'm sure you understand." "I do," he said calmly. "I like harmony. I also like my neighbors to lead with honesty." Her mouth twitched. I'll keep it in mind, he said, then turned back to his weights. Karen lingered for a beat too long, then finally turned and walked away, her heels tapping the driveway like a metronome of suppressed rage. By Friday, Karen had already summoned an informal HOA meeting over text. The group chat, Willow Watch, lit up with passive remarks masked as questions. Has anyone mentioned that driveway paint color to him yet? Is that sound system legal? Did we approve a basketball hoop in front of a luxury property? The veil was thin, the messages thick with coded panic. Shaq read every word. They thought he wouldn't notice. They always did. But he wasn't a man to confront noise with more noise. He had learned long ago that silence, properly used, was louder than a scream. He cut the lawn himself, kept the curb spotless, parked his car exactly where the bylaws said he could. He went to the HOA meeting and didn't say a word unless addressed. He played the game, but not for them. He played it because he had mastered it. Still, the stares didn't stop. The tension grew subtle teeth. A trash bin knocked over, a package delayed, the subtle way a neighbor would stop speaking the moment he stepped outside. But Shaq didn't shrink. He took his walks. He worked in his garage. He had his groceries delivered, but sometimes deliberately went out just to be seen, calm, present, unapologetic. In a place where presence alone could feel like provocation, he made it known. He wasn't going anywhere. White Willow Lane had seen money before, but it had never seen him. The tension wasn't loud, it wasn't violent, but it buzzed like a wire under the skin. And in homes with perfect porches and mirrored backsplashes, resentment festered like mildew in silence. And that silence? It was just starting to crack. The trouble didn't start with broken glass or shouted words. It started with paper. The first envelope arrived 4 days after Shaq settled in. A formal HOA notice tucked neatly into his mailbox. Its wording polite but patronizing. A gentle reminder to adhere to community standards regarding trash receptacle storage. He stared at the line for a beat, eyebrows lifting. His bins were behind the fence. Measured, legal. Still, he didn't react. Then came the second. This one cited a decorative inconsistency in his window treatments. Too dark. Not neutral enough for neighborhood cohesion. No name signed. Just the sterile stamp of the White Willow Association. Shaq pinned both notices to a corkboard in the kitchen and poured himself coffee. He didn't rage. He didn't call. He observed. The pattern was clear. Quiet. Calculated. A whisper campaign in official ink. By the end of week 2, the third notice appeared. Non-standard landscaping edges. A new one. And when Shaq stepped out to see what they meant, he found a single row of ornamental grass, trimmed to perfection by his gardener, slightly pushed out of line, as if someone had stepped through it and nudged it off. That's when he told Devin. Devin Carter had been with him since the Atlanta property. Personal assistant, logistics manager, and one of the few people Shaq trusted completely. A former Marine with a sharp mind and dry wit. Devin was both detail-focused and deeply loyal. He arrived every morning around 9, iced coffee in hand, and left long after most of the neighborhood's porch lights flicked off. "They're poking," Shaq said one morning, holding up the third citation like a riddle. "Slow. Testing for a response." Devin frowned, taking the paper. "Anyone else getting this many violations?" "No one on this block." Devin flipped it over, scanned the fine print. "I'll check the logs, and I'll make sure the cams are recording everything." Shaq nodded once. "They're setting me up for something. Not sure what yet." Later that afternoon, it happened. The package was a standard brown Amazon box, protein supplements. Nothing flashy. Shaq's house had 4 cameras, 2 front-facing, 1 in the garage, and 1 angled toward the side entrance, where deliveries were often dropped. At 3:17 p.m., the footage showed the package arrive. At 3:42 it showed a figure bending over it. A white hoodie, floral leggings, blonde bun barely visible beneath a wide-brimmed hat. They didn't steal it. They cut it. A thin slice along the seam. Careful. Curious. Testing. Not taking. When Devin played the footage back, his jaw set tight. "She's not even trying to hide it." Shaq leaned over his shoulder. Silent. The resolution was clear enough. It wasn't full-on evidence. Not yet. But it was her, Karen Caldwell, or someone close to her, acting on cue. "I'll run facial comparison against our last block meet and greet shots," Devin said. "Won't be hard." Shaq exhaled, slow and deliberate, his massive frame still as stone. "She's building a narrative. Devin looked up. What kind of narrative? One where I'm the threat, he said. The angry outsider. The one with something to hide. The next HOA citation came the next day. A formal notice requesting removal of the non-standard delivery locker, a secure box attached to the porch wall. It had been there since move-in. Approved in advance. The note now claimed it was unsightly and disruptive to the architectural flow of the street. Shaq didn't reply. He printed the original HOA email approving the box and tacked it on his kitchen corkboard, now growing more crowded by the day. Karen's game wasn't loud. It wasn't messy. It was pristine and polished. Paper cuts over time, tiny bleeding wounds, dressed in polite language. And she never appeared angry. She smiled. She smiled when she waved from her driveway, in her cashmere cardigan. She smiled when she passed him walking her poodle, lips painted pink, posture composed, even when Shaq caught her glancing, just a beat too long from behind her mail slot or her second-story curtains. The expression never broke. But behind that smile was strategy. Karen Caldwell didn't throw tantrums. She filed reports. She wasn't feared because she was loud. She was feared because she didn't have to be. In HOA meetings, she steered with careful phrasing and tight-lipped nods. She didn't shout. She framed. Concerned homeowners have mentioned, or there's been quiet discomfort about. By the third week, Shaq's presence had already shifted the rhythm of the neighborhood. Conversations stopped when he walked by. Lawns got clipped faster. Eyes lingered a second too long. That Tuesday, during a block beautification walkthrough, really just a disguised HOA inspection, Karen stood on the sidewalk with her clipboard in hand, 4 other homeowners at her side. All white, all nervous. Shaq emerged from his garage, wiping his hands on a towel, nodding to the group without expectation. Karen's smile widened. "Mr. Hawkins," she called brightly, "we're just taking notes for our seasonal landscaping review." Shaq nodded. "Let me know if you need anything clarified."
Oh,
She replied, tilting her head. "We always keep things transparent." One of the neighbors, Dennis, 2 doors down, murmured something and looked away. That night, Devin stayed late. They reviewed footage, cross-checked timestamps, logged citations, created a timeline. "She's too precise," Devin muttered. "She's engineering escalation without triggering the obvious stuff. She wants to corner me into snapping," Shaq said, leaning against the countertop, his expression unreadable. "She wants fear. That's the play. Fear makes people easy to shape." Devin's eyes narrowed. "So what do? We document. We stay calm, and we don't give her what she's after." But even Shaq could feel the weight now. Subtle, growing, pressing down like humidity before a storm. He could feel it in the way the cashier at the local grocer flinched when she saw his name on the ID. The way the dog walker across the street crossed to the other sidewalk without ever quite making eye contact. It wasn't just Karen anymore. It was the idea of him. Big Shaq. Tall. Powerful. Black. Successful. Present. Too present.
That weekend, the neighborhood app began to buzz.
The post didn't mention Shaq by name, but it didn't have to. New resident appears to have delivery traffic outside expected norms. HOA looking into it. Then came the second post. Suspicious packaging activity. Seen on Willow Lane. Reminder to be vigilant and report anything unusual. Shaq stared at the screen, lips pressed tight. The posts were vague, carefully written, but they were seeds. Karen wasn't trying to fight him. She was trying to frame him. Slowly, deliberately, she was painting a picture. A man who disturbed the balance. A man whose presence invited disruption. A threat. And she was doing it without ever raising her voice. It began with the low rumble of power. The kind of sound that didn't just travel. It announced. At 4:43 p.m., on a cloudless Thursday, the gates of White Willow Lane opened to the deep growl of a custom matte black sports car gliding up the road like a shadow with teeth. It wasn't reckless. It wasn't loud out of defiance. It was tuned, sleek, efficient, dominant in silence until it chose not to be. The kind of car you heard before you saw. And when it rolled to a slow, deliberate stop in front of Big Shaq's white-stoned circular driveway, the neighborhood exhaled. The vehicle was signature, one of a kind, valued north of $400,000. Modified Italian precision, wrapped in matte obsidian, black on black, even the rims dipped in shadow. The hood glinted in the late sunlight, aggressive and smooth, low to the ground like it was hunting pavement. No decals, no branding, just presence. Shaq stepped out, slowly, like he'd done it 1,000 times before. Not to make a show, not to provoke, just because it was his, and the day was his, and the moment asked for nothing but ownership. He didn't glance around. He didn't need to. He knew every curtain had shifted. Every set of blinds now had a gap. He knew that silence in White Willow Lane didn't mean stillness. It meant watching. He closed the car door with a muted click, the sound crisp against the hush of a summer afternoon. And that's when it began. Karen Caldwell emerged from her house like a storm on legs. Her door swung open faster than it should have for someone so calculated. Her face tight, her jaw clenched, her pink blouse caught in the breeze like a flag planted in enemy soil. She didn't walk, she marched, arms pumping with moral indignation, phone in hand, clipboard under arm. She didn't greet him. She addressed the neighborhood. "This is unacceptable." Her voice rose instantly, bouncing off stucco walls and well-manicured lawns. That thing rattled my windows." Shaq turned, arms loose at his sides, one brow raised, not high, just enough, calm, cool, but alert. Karen stopped at the edge of his driveway, deliberately not stepping over it. "Not yet. This is a residential community, Mr. Hawkins. We don't welcome noise. We don't tolerate disruption. This isn't downtown. We value peace, respect, order." Her voice trembled not from fear, but from the weight of a script she had rehearsed 1,000 times. One that had always worked, until now. Shaq didn't speak for a long second. The sun gleamed off the polished hood beside him. The air was still. His voice, when it came, was velvet over steel. "I was respectful when I moved in. I've followed every rule, paid every due, filed every form. You're the one raising your voice." Karen's lips tightened. "It's the car. You can't bring a machine like that into this kind of neighborhood and expect it to fit." Shaq took a step toward her, measured, steady, not threatening, just present. "I didn't buy it to fit. I bought it because I earned it." She exhaled sharply, shifting her weight. "Some people," she started, her voice quivering just enough to be noticeable, "think luxury gives them the right to ignore the culture of a place. But we've built something here. We work to protect it, from all kinds of elements." And there it was. The subtext laid bare. Elements. Shaq said nothing for a beat, letting her words hang between them, the way smoke clings to curtains. He could feel the weight of the moment growing, not between them, but around them. He knew eyes were on him. The neighbors didn't need to open their doors anymore. They had front row seats from the safety of their windows. He glanced once, subtle, and caught the flick of a curtain 2 houses down. "I'm not a threat to your values," he said finally, his voice low, deliberate. "But if your values mean quiet oppression dressed up in fine linens, then yeah, I'm here to disrupt that." Karen looked stunned for a second, not by the words but by the fact that he said them out loud. Unflinching, like he wasn't afraid of how it sounded. She took another step, this time onto the driveway. Just a toe over the line. "You don't get to define what dignity looks like in this neighborhood," she snapped. Shaq's shoulders squared, not puffed up, not defensive. Just steady, immovable. The kind of calm that made people nervous because it didn't flinch under pressure. "No," he replied, "but you don't get to gatekeep it either." That landed. It landed hard. Behind them, across the street, a car slowed as it passed. Someone in the passenger seat craned their neck to look. No one honked. No one waved. This wasn't just a conversation anymore. It was a scene. Karen glanced toward the car, then back at Shaq. Her mouth opened, then closed again. She wasn't used to pushback. Not like this. Not so direct. Her power had always been implied, unspoken but enforced. But here, in front of the car, in the driveway she believed should never have belonged to him, the power shifted. Shaq folded his arms. Not to intimidate, just to end it. "I'm done having this conversation on my driveway." Karen's nostrils flared. "We'll see what the HOA has to say about this." "I look forward to their call," Shaq said, voice even, eyes calm. She stood there a moment longer, then turned, not defeated, but destabilized. As she walked back across the street, the silence didn't resume. It stayed. Shaq walked inside, shutting the door behind him with no ceremony, no slam, no muttered curse, just the soft thud of a man refusing to be reduced. Inside, Devin sat at the kitchen counter, watching the live stream on his tablet, a small smirk on his lips. "She's going to feel that," he said. Shaq poured himself a glass of water, didn't respond right away. Then, Let her. Outside, the car gleamed in the falling light. A symbol. A target. A statement. But most of all, a reminder. He wasn't going anywhere. Shaq sat at the kitchen counter, the 3 papers spread before him like pieces on a chessboard. Across from him, Devon paced, jaw tight, tablet in hand. "This isn't random," Devon said. "It's deliberate. Someone's pushing this." Shaq didn't respond right away. His face remained unreadable, but something behind his eyes had shifted. Not anger, but calculation. "Run a trace," he said finally. "Start with the HOA board. Minutes, memos. See who brought what to the table." Devon nodded, already pulling up search queries. The next 2 hours passed in silence, the kind reserved for legal footwork and war planning. The break came in the form of an internal thread from a private HOA forum, buried in the metadata of a PDF Devon downloaded through a backdoor proxy. A trail of edits revealed the origin of the violation drafts. "Found it," Devon said, eyes narrowing. "Karen. Every single one was authored by her before being reviewed by the board. She's been engineering the entire campaign." He spun the screen toward Shaq. The name K. Caldwell sat at the top of a digital log of comments, suggestions, and final revisions. "Hell," Devon muttered. "She even tagged you by name. This isn't subtle, it's personal." Shaq leaned back in his chair, gaze fixed on the screen. The corner of his mouth twitched. Not a smile, something closer to restraint being tested. "Then it's time I met the neighbors," he said. The HOA meeting was held in the community clubhouse, a glass and cedar structure that sat like a temple in the center of White Willow Lane. Inside, the lighting was too warm, the smiles too practiced, and the coffee too weak. A circle of plastic chairs had been arranged with passive-aggressive symmetry, as though disagreement might be minimized if everyone sat just far enough apart. Shaq walked in just before the meeting started. No entourage, no fanfare, just his presence. It shifted the air. Several heads turned. Whispers followed. Karen sat at the far end of the room, clipboard resting neatly in her lap, posture impeccable. Her eyes flicked toward him, then away, as if she hadn't noticed, as if her entire week hadn't been spent orchestrating the moment he would have no choice but to react. Shaq didn't sit. Not right away. He walked to the front, waited for the murmurs to die, and addressed the board directly. "I'm here to address a series of escalating compliance notices," he said, voice calm, firm. "All issued within a 10-day window. All without cause." A balding man named Vernon cleared his throat from behind the folding table. "Mr. Hawkins, the HOA has standards." "I've reviewed the standards," Shaq said. "I've also reviewed the bylaws, and the archived minutes, and more recently, the authorship logs of each violation letter." He turned, locked eyes with Karen. Each one drafted before discussion, each one traced back to a single contributor. He clicked a remote, projecting a file onto the screen behind him. Karen's name lit up under each digital footprint. Silence fell like a curtain. Someone coughed in the back. Another board member, a woman named Darlene, glanced at Karen, then leaned away slightly, like the smell of smoke had just reached her nostrils. Shaq didn't move from his place. "I respect rules," he said. "I don't respect selective enforcement. I moved here for peace, not to be monitored like a problem waiting to happen." Karen straightened in her seat, her voice cutting in with the polish of someone used to reclaiming control. "I was merely doing due diligence. If you feel targeted, Mr. Hawkins, perhaps you should consider whether your behavior—" Shaq didn't raise his voice. "You placed an anonymous complaint about my assistant retrieving packages." That stopped her. Her lips parted slightly, but nothing came out. "You've cited my driveway, my lighting, my landscaping, all of which match community standards. The only thing that seems to offend you is that I live here." He stepped back, allowing the silence to deepen. The HOA president cleared his throat. "We'll be reviewing the recent complaints and auditing protocol." Shaq nodded once. "Good. I'll be reviewing my legal options if the harassment continues." He turned to go. No grand exit. No pointed stare. Just deliberate, unmistakable grace, under pressure. Karen didn't follow. She didn't speak again. But something in her expression cracked. Not a confession, but the fracture of a mask that had grown too tight. The next day, the notices stopped. But Karen didn't. Shaq returned home that evening to find her walking her dog. Not her usual route. Not her usual time. She paused at the edge of his property, staring at the driveway as if daring it to grow weeds. He walked past her without a word. But he felt it. The story had changed. Karen wasn't trying to make him leave anymore. She was trying to make him snap. The late afternoon sun bent low over White Willow Lane, casting long orange shadows across the manicured lawns and cobblestone curbs. The air hung thick with the kind of quiet that doesn't signal peace, but tension. It was the quiet before a thunderclap. Shaq had just returned from a community fundraiser downtown. His matte black sports car, a custom electric hypercar with tinted bulletproof windows and a whisper-smooth engine, pulled into the driveway with dignified grace, barely a sound over the street's hush. The neighbors watched from behind curtains, pretending not to. He stepped out in a navy blue tailored suit, sleeves rolled just slightly at the cuffs, gold cufflinks gleaming in the sunlight. His presence was effortless, unapologetic. He moved toward the porch with the relaxed precision of a man who knew every eye was on him, and chose stillness over spectacle. He barely noticed Karen at first, but he should have. The signs had been there, the dog walking detours, the muttered remarks near mailboxes, the HOA emails that had stopped but still echoed. There was a shift in the air tonight, subtle but charged. Karen was standing across the street, still as a statue in her pale blouse and pastel headband. Her dog leash hung slack in one hand, the other gripping something metal and sharp, a gardening claw, the kind designed to tear through roots. Before Shaq could reach his steps, she was moving. Quick, calculated, heels striking pavement like a gavel. Her face wore something between determination and fury, something brittle pretending to be brave. She didn't yell, she didn't warn, she just walked straight into the driveway, like she owned it. And then, without hesitation, she raised the claw and sank it into the hood of his car. The metal shrieked as she dragged it downward in a violent arc, stripping paint and gouging deep into the alloy beneath. Shaq froze mid-step. His face didn't twist. His arms didn't raise. He just stood, towering and silent, watching her hand rise again. Another slash. Then another. The claw screeched as it carved 3 jagged tears down the side of the car, raw silver glinting through the matte finish. Only then did she speak. "You think you can intimidate us?" she shouted, turning toward him, waving the claw as if she were the one defending herself. "Think your money, your cars, your attitude give you the right to come in here and act like you're better than everyone?" Shaq didn't move. He didn't say a word. His eyes narrowed, but his body remained still. A mountain, in a storm. "You threatened me," Karen suddenly screamed, her voice pitching high and sharp. "You cornered me earlier, said I'd pay for disrespecting you." It was a lie so precise, so rehearsed, it made the silence feel complicit. A few houses down, a porch light flicked on. Curtains shifted. Someone stood behind a screen door, but no one stepped out. Karen dropped the claw, letting it clatter on the concrete, like it had been forced from her hand. She clutched her chest, breathing heavily, theatrically. "He came at me just now," she cried. "He was about to hit me." Her voice cracked with mock terror. "He said he was going to destroy me." Shaq didn't blink. He didn't move. But inside, something burned. Not rage, something colder. A recognition of the performance being staged in real time, and the audience too afraid to call it out. "Somebody call the police," Karen wailed. "Please, before he hurts me." 2 houses down, a phone lifted. A hesitant voice muttered, "Yeah, I think there's a situation here." Devin wasn't home yet. Shaq was alone on the porch, alone in the neighborhood, and he knew deep down that no matter how calm he stayed, no matter how loudly the car screamed under the damage of her claw, his word wouldn't be enough. Still, he didn't move. His silence wasn't submission, it was survival. His voice, if used, would be twisted. His body, if shifted forward even an inch, would be fear. Then from across the street came a different sound, a beep short and mechanical. Atop a BMX bike sat a boy no older than 16. His phone raised, camera rolling. He hadn't looked away. He hadn't retreated behind a curtain. He had captured the entire thing. Shaq saw him. So did Karen, and her entire performance stuttered. You can't film people like this," she barked at the boy. He didn't reply, just kept filming. The lens was still. Karen's voice dropped. "Delete that video." The teen didn't flinch. "It's live," he said. "Instagram. You can't delete a live." Karen's eyes darted back to Shaq, now slowly stepping toward the car. His movements were still composed, deliberate, not dangerous. He crouched next to the gouges in the paint, ran a hand slowly along the claw marks, The damage was unmistakable. He straightened, tall and firm, and looked directly at her. "You done?" he asked, voice even. Karen's mouth opened, closed. Her posture deflated just slightly, but she still had one card left to play. And she played it. The sirens pierced the air exactly 34 seconds later. Red and blue spun across white siding in perfect hedges. A cruiser pulled up, fast, tires chirping at the curb. 2 officers stepped out, both white, one older, one young, both alert. Karen immediately broke into sobs. "He threatened me. I didn't know what else to do. He was coming toward me. I got scared." Shaq remained exactly where he was. Hands visible, posture straight, voice quiet. "I didn't touch her," he said. "She came on my property. That's my car. You can see the weapon she used. I have no weapons on me." There's also a live recording kit across the street. The officers exchanged a glance. The older one turned toward Karen. "Ma'am, did you damage the vehicle?" "I was defending myself," she insisted. He looked at me like I didn't even matter. Shaq exhaled, slow and silent. The younger officer turned toward him, more cautious than confrontational. "Sir, we're going to need both of you to stay put while we get statements. You're not being detained at this moment, but we need to figure out what happened." Karen's performance sputtered under the weight of the camera, the officers, and the raw evidence of a destroyed $400,000 car in full view. "I need medical," she suddenly declared, clutching her side. He glared at me so hard I felt faint. "I have trauma." Shaq blinked once. Nothing more. The older officer stepped back, rubbing the bridge of his nose. "We've got a live witness, video evidence, and 2 parties with drastically different stories. Until we verify everything, nobody's going anywhere." A few more neighbors emerged now. Tentative, unsure. Some said nothing. Some hovered near their porches. But the silence wasn't so sure of itself anymore. Shaq looked over at the teen, who gave him a small nod and spoke, clear, steady. "I got it all. She's lying." And just like that, the foundation beneath Karen cracked. What had started as a stage was now a courtroom. And this time she wasn't the only one controlling the script. Across the digital universe, the news didn't take long to catch fire. By the time Shaq was seated in the back of the cruiser, his name had already hit the top 5 trending topics on Twitter. "NBA legend involved in violent suburban dispute," read the first wave. "Shaquille O'Neal detained after neighborhood altercation," said the next, more cautious. But the one that hit hardest came an hour later. TMZ exclusive. "He glared at me like he owned the place." Karen's quote, ripped from context, plastered across social media like neon graffiti. In the station, the questions came fast but measured. The officers weren't aggressive. They were careful. The kind of careful that reveals their assumptions. Shaq answered every question clearly. He pointed out the teen's video. He explained what had happened. The claw, the accusations, the lies. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't smirk. He simply told the truth. Stone by stone, building the defense they already seemed hesitant to hear. Back at the house, Devin had arrived just as the squad car pulled away. His jaw tightened as he saw the scratched car, the neighbors whispering, and Karen giving a shaky no comment to a bystander with a camera phone. He went straight inside, grabbed his iPad, and opened Shaq's emergency protocol folder, one the 2 of them had drafted long ago, not out of paranoia, but preparation. Within minutes, he had Lana Briggs on the phone. Lana was not a typical lawyer. She didn't wear pearls or speak in soft assurances. She was a Harvard-educated firestorm, with a courtroom kill count and a list of clients that made Forbes editors salivate. She picked up on the second ring. "What's the damage?" she asked. "Viral," Devin said, walking into the kitchen. "Videos circulating but not fast enough." TMZ ran a slanted headline. "Karen's laying it on thick. Cops just took him downtown. No charges yet." Lana didn't curse. She didn't gasp. She simply exhaled through her nose and replied, "Don't speak to anyone. I'm in the car in 15. Devin nodded, even though she couldn't see it. Already scrubbed his socials, blocked his Instagram, legal Twitter's already weighing in. "Then we get ahead of it," she said. "If they're going to paint him angry, we show calm. If they show property, we show restraint. And if she's playing scared white woman in suburbia, we remind America this man built an empire without raising his voice." "Copy," Devin said.
See you soon.
Outside, the murmurs had shifted. Some neighbors were now openly speculating. Others huddled in small knots, throwing furtive glances toward the damaged car. One woman whispered to her husband. I mean, it's always the ones with flash, right? Her husband replied. Doesn't matter who he is. This isn't the NBA. It's a neighborhood. The online world was less subtle. One camp flooded the feeds with support. Y'all really think Shaq has to threaten anyone? She vandalized his car, then cried about it. Classic. We're with you, big man. But another side, colder, louder, spun the narrative with stunning speed. Rich celebs always act like the rules don't apply. If he wasn't intimidating, why'd the woman feel scared? Just because he's famous doesn't mean he's innocent. Shaq's team posted nothing. The silence, for once, was part of the strategy. At the station, Lana arrived in under an hour, her coat swinging behind her like a cape. She entered the interrogation room with authority that didn't require introduction. My client will be answering no further questions, she said, her tone professional but final. You have eyewitnesses. You have a video. You have a destroyed car, and a man who did not retaliate. So if you have charges, file them. If not, we're done. The officers blinked. One cleared his throat. No charges at this time. We're done, she repeated, then turned to Shaq. Let's go. As they stepped outside, Devin met them at the car. He handed Shaq a tablet showing a split screen. Karen's dramatics on one side, the teen's video on the other. It had been shared over 700,000 times. Major outlets were beginning to update their stories. The tide was shifting. This is the moment, Lana said as they slid into the back of the car. They pushed first. Now we pivot. Now we show them who you really are. Shaq finally let out a breath, not relief, but resolution. They're not ready, he said quietly. Lana gave him a sidelong glance. They will be. Outside, the sun dipped below the line of perfect rooftops, leaving White Willow Lane in a long shadow. Inside those houses, people watched their screens, read headlines, passed judgment. But none of them had seen what was coming. Because for the first time in this fight, the world wasn't only listening to her version. They were watching him. It started with a single post, grainy footage, muted audio, but the image was crystal clear. Karen Caldwell standing in Big Shaq's driveway with a clawed garden tool raised above her head, her blouse wrinkled, her face twisted in effort, mid-swing as it crashed down on the matte black hood of his prized sports car. The clip was barely 8 seconds long, pulled directly from Shaq's own surveillance system, and released quietly through an anonymous community watchdog account. No press release, no captions, just truth, raw and undeniable. Within minutes, it spread like a spark in dry grass. People didn't even wait for verification. The footage spoke for itself, the screech of metal, the way she looked around before the first strike, the smug precision of her aim. It wasn't the breakdown of a frightened woman, it was the tantrum of someone who believed she was above consequence. Karen's spin came fast and desperate. Within hours she released a statement through her attorney, an open letter to the press. I suffered a severe emotional breakdown brought on by months of silent intimidation and fear. I truly believed I was in danger. My actions were the result of long-standing trauma and a fight-or-flight response that I now regret deeply. There was no apology to Shaq, no mention of the weapon in her hand or the deliberate nature of her actions, just a carefully drafted portrait of a woman, unraveling under stress, and trying to shift the narrative one more time. The press ate it up, but this time something changed. Shaq said nothing. No press conferences. No reactive tweets. No emotional live streams. Instead, his team simply posted the full surveillance video. Unedited, high definition, and silent. No commentary. No hashtags. Just a direct line from his front door camera to the truth. In the video, Karen didn't look distressed. She looked composed, focused. She adjusted her grip between strikes. Her expression was calculating, not panicked. When she finally dropped the tool, she smoothed her hair and backed away like she'd just taken out the trash. And then, as if on cue, she clasped her chest and stumbled toward the sidewalk, already performing. The silence that followed was deafening. Across White Willow Lane, the neighbors began to whisper, but the tone was no longer curious or scandalized. It was uneasy. Disbelief gave way to discomfort. The myth of Karen Caldwell, the composed, protective head of the HOA, had cracked. Some residents began walking past Shaq's property a little slower, peering up at the repaired front of his car with something that looked almost like guilt. Others started avoiding Karen altogether, crossing streets rather than making small talk at the mailbox. One older couple left a pie at Shaq's front door. No note. Just the gesture. Devin noticed it first. "They're folding," he said quietly as he reviewed new footage from the outdoor cameras. No one's defending her in the Facebook group anymore, and 5 of the original HOA board members just submitted resignations. Shaq didn't respond. He just nodded and closed his laptop. It wasn't over. He knew that. But the storm was shifting. And now, it wasn't only circling him. The media pushed harder. Local anchors requested interviews. National outlets offered exclusive appearances. One talk show host's assistant emailed Shaq's team 6 times in a single morning. Still, he stayed silent. It wasn't apathy. It was strategy. He had already said enough without saying a word. And the longer he stayed quiet, the louder the footage spoke. Karen's damage control spiraled. She was spotted leaving her house in sunglasses and a wide-brim hat, avoiding eye contact. Paparazzi caught her in a grocery store aisle, visibly distressed. Her lawyer released a second statement claiming she'd been doxxed and harassed, shifting blame again. But the public wasn't buying it anymore.
The footage was too clean. The act too performative.
And Big Shaq, stoic, calm, composed, stood in stark contrast to her unraveling performance. He had become the eye of the storm, where the chaos swirled around him. Articles, interviews, speculation. He remained unshaken, his image not as an NBA titan, but as a man defending his right to peace. Behind closed doors, though, the weight pressed deeper. In the quiet of his home, he paced slower, slept lighter. Devin noticed the way he paused at windows now, checking blind spots, not out of fear, out of calculation. Karen may have stumbled, but she wasn't finished. People like her didn't crumble all at once. They eroded in waves, trying to drag others down with them. But Shaq had weathered real storms, and he wasn't stepping back. He spent his days reviewing legal updates, coordinating with Lana, and moving with precision. Every word planned, every next step considered. At night, when the neighborhood settled, Shaq sat on his porch, not to watch but to be seen. Not a performance, a statement. This was still his home. Across the street, Karen's curtains remained closed. The whispers grew into distance. Fewer neighbors waved when she walked by. Even her closest allies, the ones who once clung to her HOA authority, started distancing themselves publicly. The shift wasn't loud. It was slow, quiet, inevitable, like respect returning to where it belonged. Devin stepped outside one evening and found Shaq staring up at the sky, coffee in hand. The stars were out, but faint against the neighborhood glow. "They're still talking," Devin said. Shaq didn't look at him. "Let them. They're saying you handled it like a king." Shaq finally turned, a small smile tugging at one corner of his mouth. "Not a king," he said, "just a man who didn't flinch." And for the first time since the glass had shattered on his car, Big Shaq allowed himself to exhale. Not in surrender, but in quiet satisfaction. The storm hadn't passed, but he'd already survived the center of it. Before Russell could reply, Lana Briggs appeared behind Shaq, having arrived without fanfare, dressed in a deep navy pantsuit that made silence seem like strategy, not absence. She gave Russell a long look and said, "Interesting choice of words, because I have 6 public statements from former employees of your firm, most of them women who would argue your household has a history of making others look crazy." Russell stiffened. "You're bluffing." Lana smiled, slow and sharp. "I don't bluff. I verify." She handed him a folder, thin, discreet, but heavy with implication. Inside, screenshots of derogatory internal memos, a leaked thread from his private Slack channel, containing racist jokes under his username, and most damning, an anonymous Reddit AMA by a whistleblower from his own company. It had gone viral 2 days earlier. Devin had seen to that. "You've been busy," Shaq said quietly, glancing at Devin. Devin nodded, not smug, just efficient. Once we connected the Reddit post to Russell's firm through metadata, it was just about following the trail. Russell opened the folder with forced calm, his fingers twitching at the edges of the pages. "This is defamation." "No," Lana replied. "It's discovery." The crowd around them wasn't whispering anymore. They were just listening. Shaq leaned forward slightly, not threatening, just larger than the moment. "You could have said nothing, could have let your wife own her mess. But instead you walked into this room trying to scare me with your resume. Turns out yours is messier than mine." Russell tried to laugh, but it caught in his throat. "People forget fast. These things don't stick." Lana raised an eyebrow. "Maybe they used to. But this neighborhood has eyes now, an internet. As if on cue, Devin's phone vibrated. He checked the screen, nodded, and held it up so Lana and Shaq could see. A trending tab was glowing. Caldwell cover-up. Twitter had already begun the storm. Screenshots of the folder Devin sent to an anonymous journalist were now front-page Reddit content. Instagram activists had clipped together old HOA meeting photos, Russell's company's diversity statements, and Karen's surveillance footage into slick reels. TikTok edits featured slow zooms of Russell's old press conferences over ominous beats, ending with Shaq's quote from the earlier incident. "You don't get to define dignity." Russell reached for his phone. Fumbled the unlock. Lana tilted her head. "Might want to get ahead of your board of directors. The internet has a memory now." He backed away, no longer smiling, no longer standing tall. Across the room, someone murmured, "I always knew something was off about that couple." Another neighbor, half whispering, added, "They treated the HOA like it was their kingdom." But Shaq didn't gloat. He didn't nod or posture. He just stepped aside and walked toward the refreshments table, like the moment hadn't rattled him at all. Devin followed. Lana stayed back just long enough to make eye contact with Russell one last time. "You should sit down. Your world's going to tilt fast." He didn't move, just stood there with the folder limp in his hand, surrounded by people who no longer had a reason to pretend they respected him. Outside, the air was cooling. Inside, the room had lost all pretense. Big Shaq had entered as a neighbor, but when he walked out that night, he wasn't just the man with the broken car. He was the man who didn't blink while the power flipped hands. By the time the first media van parked on White Willow Lane, the neighborhood's illusion of unity had already cracked wide open. What had once been a manicured suburban sanctuary now buzzed with tension thick enough to taste. The headlines were no longer whispers. They screamed from car radios and morning shows. "NBA legend accuses HOA of racism and retaliation." Neighbors who once exchanged only lawn care tips and pie recipes now walked their dogs on opposite sides of the street. Some refused eye contact altogether, pretending their blinds had never opened to the chaos. Others, emboldened by Shaq's quiet defiance, began to nod, wave, even speak up tentatively at first. But even gestures carried weight now. Shaq remained composed. His house, fortress-like in its sleek design and tinted windows, stood untouched but no longer silent. Every camera on the property had been upgraded. Devin managed the footage like a producer on a documentary series, documenting every move, every delivery, every glance, not because they were scared, but because they understood the war was no longer in whispers. It was televised. Then came the interviews. Karen and Russell emerged from the shadows of public shame and slid directly into the lights of conservative cable news. They didn't sit on dingy couches in back rooms. They were dressed like they were attending a gala. Russell in a blue-checked blazer, an American flag lapel pin. Karen in a high-neck ivory blouse that played at innocence. Their segment aired just after prime time, framed by graphics dripping in patriotic red and blue. Neighborhood nightmare, cancel culture at the gate. Karen's voice quivered on cue. "We never expected to feel unsafe in our own neighborhood. We supported diversity, of course we did. But when someone moves in and immediately disrupts the peace, it forces you to protect your family." Russell chimed in with a slow nod, face carved in solemnity. "This wasn't about race. It's about arrogance. About a celebrity who thinks the rules don't apply to him and turns every disagreement into a public spectacle." The host leaned forward like a vulture with a velvet glove. "And now you're facing public backlash for defending your property, correct?" Karen gave the smallest, most deliberate nod. "I just want people to know, we are not the villains here." The clip was shared, dissected, and memed within hours. Shaq's silence was treated as mystery. Karen's tears became viral reaction gifs. Russell's words were overlaid with slow motion and audio remixes by creators who didn't buy a single syllable of their story. Devin called Lana the moment the segment aired. "They've gone full propaganda," he said, pacing near the kitchen island. "They're preloading the jury pool. We need to move fast." Lana had already anticipated it. "Then let's hit them where it hurts." Within 24 hours, the civil lawsuit was drafted and filed. O'Neill v. Caldwell et al. The charges were stacked like bricks. Defamation of character, destruction of private property, intentional infliction of emotional distress, civil harassment, public misrepresentation, and HOA misconduct. Shaq's lawyers didn't just build a case. They constructed a public statement. The press release was brief but lethal. "My client has chosen to fight this not in anger, but with accountability. Truth deserves its day." That day is now scheduled. And that's when White Willow Lane truly split. One camp, mostly older residents, homeowners with long-standing HOA ties, clung to the narrative the Caldwells spun, that Shaq was stirring unnecessary drama, that he didn't fit in, that fame had made him paranoid. The other camp, newer families, young professionals, the few residents of color, saw it differently. They saw Shaq not as an outsider but as someone who had the nerve to stand tall in a place that hoped he'd shrink. Yard signs appeared overnight. Not the typical election signs, but ones coded in subtlety. Support our community. Read one with a bluebird logo. A quiet nod to Karen's media appearance. Truth lives here, countered another in simple black and white font on Shaq's lawn. The HOA, once wielded like a royal scepter by Karen, began to unravel. One by one, board members resigned. First Greg Thompson, the treasurer, who cited personal discomfort with recent events. Then Valerie Crenshaw, who simply emailed the neighborhood listserv a 3-word statement: "I am done." By the end of the week, the HOA board was down to Karen and one silent, sweating man named Kurt, who hadn't spoken up since the windshield incident. Meetings were canceled. Emails went unanswered. The HOA's once pristine grip on the neighborhood's appearance was now unraveling along with its credibility. In response, Karen took the offensive. She began posting open letters to the neighborhood through Nextdoor and email blasts, some as PDFs with HOA letterhead. The letters were signed with grace, but read like veiled threats wrapped in legalese. Phrases like certain individuals leveraging media attention for personal gain and disturbances unbecoming of a luxury community peppered each paragraph. Shaq never responded directly. He didn't need to. Every legal motion his team filed was echoed by a news update. Every camera on his property showed him walking peacefully, exercising in the backyard, waving once at the mailman. None of it dramatic, just human. And that, more than any press conference, worked in his favor. One afternoon, as another satellite truck idled near the neighborhood gates, Devin sat across from Shaq on the back patio. "You know," he said, stirring his coffee, "this feels bigger than just them now." Shaq didn't speak immediately. He watched 2 sparrows peck at a bird feeder near the far fence, peaceful and unaware. "It is," he finally said. "Always was." Devin nodded. "But now the neighborhood's eating itself." Shaq glanced toward the road, where a few kids were drawing chalk hearts on the sidewalk near his lawn. Then let it. At the edge of the street, Karen watched 2 from behind her porch column, barely visible, like a ghost clinging to relevance. Her world had been perfectly controlled once, governed by rules she never had to explain, only enforce. Now, her name was paired with hashtags she couldn't erase, and video clips she couldn't dispute, and still she clung to the delusion that her version of events would outlast the truth. But the tide had turned, not in a dramatic surge, but in the steady erosion of silence. At a hastily rescheduled HOA meeting conducted over Zoom, only 9 residents logged in. Karen tried to regain composure, opening the call with, "I'd like to begin by stating our core community values have always been." She was interrupted by a hand raised, then another. Then a resident spoke plainly, "We're tired of your values, Karen. You made this worse." Another voice chimed in, "You created this mess and then tried to punish someone else for surviving it." She ended the call early. The silence afterward was louder than any headline. And in his home, windows open to the air, phone buzzing with support. Big Shaq stood steady, centered in a battle no one expected him to win. Not with fists, not with fury, but with truth. And that was proving harder for Karen and Russell to silence than anything they'd ever faced before. The courtroom looked more like a studio on the first morning of the trial. Press seats filled to capacity, live stream equipment discreetly mounted in corners, and rows of civilians turned observers, their attention locked on the entrance like they were waiting for an opening scene. This wasn't just a legal proceeding, it was spectacle, and at the center of it stood Big Shaq, unshaken. He arrived in a tailored navy suit, crisp white shirt, and no tie. No entourage, just Devin at his side, silent and firm. Lana Briggs, his attorney, carried a thick case folder under her arm, cool as marble. The moment Shaq stepped into the gallery, heads turned not because of his size, but because of the energy, calm, composed, immovable. Across the aisle, Karen wore a powder blue blazer, a pearl necklace she'd posted about once on Instagram, as a gift from the board. She held a tissue, though her eyes were dry. Russell sat beside her, square-jawed and stiff, his expression a mix of smoldering resentment and barely concealed panic. Their attorney looked like he was holding his breath with every passing moment. Opening statements set the tone. The prosecution was deliberate, professional, not performative. They laid out the evidence clearly. HOA harassment, escalating tension, physical property damage, and a media smear campaign intended to discredit and intimidate a public figure for daring to exist without submission. The defense painted a different picture. An unfortunate series of misunderstandings, they called it. A neighborly dispute that spun out of control. Emotionally charged reactions from people under pressure. Karen was distraught, fragile, reacting to perceived danger. But the facts didn't bend. Witnesses began to take the stand, and the tide turned early. First was Mr. Lawson from 3 doors down. Retired dentist. HOA supporter. Voted for Karen in every board cycle. And yet when asked under oath if he saw what happened during the garden claw incident, he cleared his throat and stared directly at Karen. She hit the car, repeatedly, he said. I saw it from my upstairs window. He didn't touch her, just stood there. Murmurs rippled through the gallery. Karen looked away. Next was a teenager, Lily, age 16, who lived across the street. She wore a pressed white shirt and jeans, her phone clasped between her hands like a totem. She uploaded the infamous video, and now, she confirmed it. He never raised his voice. She just started screaming. Each testimony carved deeper into the facade the Caldwells had built. One by one, their neighbors stepped into the light. Some shamefaced, others clear-eyed, and began to dismantle the lie they'd all once silently protected. When Lana introduced the surveillance footage, there was no fanfare, no slow-motion montage, just timestamps, angles, and audio. Karen smashing the windshield, her calling 911, voice high and fake panicked. Russell pacing with veiled threat. Shaq standing still, motionless except for the slow shake of his head. Then came the HOA email thread. Courtesy of Devon. Dozens of exchanges, redacted only for privacy, where Karen described Shaq's home as a brand risk for our community and demanded corrective measures. One line read, "He may have money, but he doesn't understand decorum." The prosecutor let the words hang in the room without comment. They didn't need commentary. They echoed with everything unsaid. On the third day, the judge called for the plaintiff to take the stand. All eyes turned as Shaq stood, adjusted his sleeve, and walked forward with quiet precision. No limp, no hesitation. He was sworn in, took his seat, and rested his hands loosely on the stand. The courtroom, once filled with soft whispers and coughs, stilled into absolute silence. Lana kept her questions short. "Mr. O'Neill, when you moved into White Willow Lane, what did you expect?" Shaq didn't rush his answer. "Peace," he said. "A home. I earned it. And what did you receive instead?" He took a beat. "Letters. Looks. Anonymous citations. That woman," he said, nodding toward Karen, "stood in front of my car and accused me of disrespecting her lawn because I parked it too loud." Lana allowed a faint pause. "And on the day she smashed your windshield, she came onto my property with a claw. She called the police, told them I was dangerous." He glanced toward the gallery now, eyes scanning slowly. "If there wasn't a camera, I wouldn't be here. I'd be somewhere they send people like me when folks like her cry wolf." A chill slid across the benches. Even the judge didn't move. "I didn't raise my voice," he continued, "and I didn't raise my hands. I just stood there and watched her try to steal the truth with a lie." Lana gave him one final question. "Why bring this to court?" He looked at her, then the judge. "Because if I don't, they'll do it again, to someone who doesn't have cameras, to someone who isn't famous. I didn't earn my peace just to watch them take it." When he stepped down, the silence held. Not a single eye rolled. Not a single whisper dared to break it. Karen's defense team scrambled. They tried to reframe the surveillance as contextually incomplete. They cited Karen's delicate mental state. Russell was described as a husband reacting instinctively. But the audience didn't buy it. The jury didn't either. During cross, Lana asked Karen a single question. "Is there a single moment on video where you appear frightened of Mr. O'Neill?" Karen blinked. I felt unsafe." "That's not what I asked." Karen looked down. "No." And that was it. In the final minutes of the trial, both attorneys gave their closing statements. The defense leaned on fear and disorder. Our clients were overwhelmed, pressured. They reacted to a situation they didn't understand. Lana stood and didn't pace. She placed both hands on the podium and spoke into the mic like the truth was weightless. "They understood exactly what they were doing," she said. They tried to weaponize fear. They thought silence would protect them. But the cameras don't lie, and neither does Mr. O'Neill's restraint. She paused. This isn't just about one attack. It's about entitlement. About who gets to call the police, and who ends up in handcuffs. About who's allowed to stand still without being called a threat. This isn't just a verdict. It's a chance to tell the truth where lies were loudest. The judge nodded. We'll reconvene when the jury returns with a verdict. Outside, the courthouse steps were flooded with press. Shaq didn't speak. Devin walked beside him, hand steady on his shoulder. Lana kept her sunglasses on, mouth firm. The world waited for a verdict. But inside the courtroom, the truth had already arrived. The air inside the courtroom was still, not heavy like before, not suffocating, just still, like a collective breath, waiting to be let go. The jury had returned, and every seat was filled. Reporters sat poised, pens hovering. The judge looked out over the gallery, nodding slightly to the foreperson. Has the jury reached a verdict? We have, Your Honor. Big Shaq didn't flinch. His hands rested on his thighs, fingers laced. No nerve showed, no adrenaline shakes. He had walked into arenas louder than this. And still, this moment carried a different kind of weight. Not about pride, not about revenge, just justice. The forewoman rose, a small slip of paper in her hand. On the charge of property destruction against the defendant Karen Caldwell, guilty. On the charge of filing a false police report, guilty. On the charge of incitement of harassment, guilty. Karen's face didn't crumble. Not at first. She just sat, frozen, like the words had hit her in a different language. Slowly, her chin trembled, eyes darting across the courtroom, as though looking for someone to contradict what had just been said. The forewoman continued. On the charge of aggravated intimidation against the defendant Russell Caldwell, guilty. On the charge of attempted coercion via HOA abuse, guilty. On the charge of defamation, guilty. Russell exhaled through his nose. Not a sigh, not resignation, just pressure escaping from the place where his illusion of control used to live. He didn't look at Karen. He didn't look at the jury, his eyes fixed on the polished floorboards, like there was an answer somewhere in the wood grain. The judge leaned forward. In light of the jury's unanimous decision, this court moves directly to sentencing. There was no delay, no more testimony to offer. The facts had been laid bare, and the community had spoken. What came next was simply consequence. For Karen Caldwell, the judge said, this court sentences you to 3 years supervised probation, 200 hours of mandated public service, and emotional restitution payments totaling $600,000 to Mr. O'Neill for defamation, harassment, and willful property destruction. Karen inhaled sharply. Her attorney placed a hand on her forearm, but she pulled away, stunned. I didn't, she began, but the judge raised a hand. She stopped mid-sentence. For Russell Caldwell, the judge continued, voice steady, you are fined $1 million in punitive damages. Your employer has already issued a statement of separation, and as of this ruling, your record will reflect a federal charge of harassment with civil penalties attached. Russell shifted, face hardening, but the words had already passed judgment. The judge paused, eyes roaming across the room now, neighbors, journalists, board members, before landing on Shaq. This was not a case of disagreement, he said. It was a test of civility, decency, and boundaries. What happened in White Willow Lane is not rare, but the outcome today is, because this time, the truth had a platform too loud to bury. Gavel struck. Shaq didn't move. Outside, the press swarmed, but Lana stepped in front of the microphones. Her statement was brief. My client has no further comment. The court has said everything that needed saying. Shaq turned toward the car where Devin waited. Engine running, eyes scanning the sidewalk. The ride home wasn't quiet, but it wasn't full either. Just 2 men, aware that a chapter had closed without spectacle. At the gates of White Willow Lane, the usual security guard gave a sharp nod, sharper than before. Respect now, not obligation. A few neighbors were on their lawns, pretending to trim hedges or walk dogs, but their eyes followed the car as it pulled into the driveway. The same house, the same door, but the air around it had changed. The very next week, the HOA board issued a public statement of apology, not just to Shaq, but to the broader values of integrity and accountability. 3 of its members resigned before sunset. By month's end, The organization had adopted new bylaws, mandatory transparency clauses, and a rotating leadership structure. The neighborhood newsletter announced the introduction of community harmony training, a rebranding of what everyone else knew was racial bias education. Shaq never asked for any of it. 2 days later, Lana called with an offer: take the vacant HOA seat, assume a leadership role in the reform. He smiled, just slightly. Let them lead themselves now, he said. I'm good. She laughed, just once. That's what I thought. The national media, already on to its next outrage, drifted away, but the neighborhood remained changed. A week after the verdict, Mrs. Ellenby, widow lifelong resident, left a note in Shaq's mailbox. No apology, no long speech, just 6 words on a cream-colored card. We see it clearer now. Thank you. Devin found it when he picked up the mail, and chuckled softly. Looks like your silence made more noise than their microphones ever could. Shaq didn't reply. Just tapped the note against his palm, nodded and tucked it into the drawer with his old basketball medals and one faded picture of his childhood street. The garden claw was gone. The dented hood had been replaced. But the reminder of what had been attempted here would stay. Not as trauma, but as testimony. One morning, weeks later, Shaq stood barefoot on the front lawn. A moving truck rolled down the street, stopping 3 doors down. New neighbors. Young couple. Biracial. Laughing. Carrying furniture too big for the porch and smiling through the effort. They waved. Shaq waved back. No speeches. No slogans. Just recognition. Just breath. That night, as the sun dipped behind the sycamores lining the block, Devin fired up the grill. Lana arrived with 2 bottles of wine. A few neighbors passed by, nodding, then stepping closer. Conversation flowed. Not strained, not forced, just real. At one point, someone raised a toast. Not to Shaq, not to victory, but to balance. The idea that maybe, just maybe, the street could feel like home for more than one kind of person at a time. Shaq clinked glasses and leaned back in his chair. He didn't smile much, but tonight, he allowed one. They didn't win because they yelled louder. They didn't win because they swung first. They won because they never needed to fight that way. Because truth, when rooted, doesn't flinch. And peace, when earned, doesn't beg. Janelle touched her husband's arm. We should get back to unpacking before the kids start sword fighting the moving guys. Shaq stepped back, offering one more look toward the house. The porch light fixture had been replaced. The siding painted. The roof redone. But beneath it all, something older still lived there. Now reframed as resilience, instead of resentment. You ever need anything, Shaq said. Tools, contractor names, neighborhood codes decoded. I've got the map. Curtis grinned. Appreciate that. We might have you over for dinner once the boxes disappear. Bring bourbon, Janelle added. Shaq turned back across the street, chuckling low to himself. I'm starting to like the neighbors on this block. Back on his own porch, he eased into the chair that had weathered every season since he moved in. He placed the mug down beside him, still untouched, and sat. No cameras pointed his way now. No news vans in the distance. The neighborhood was quiet, but not stifled. Peaceful, not in denial, but in recovery. The tension that once buzzed beneath every picket fence had finally lost its charge. He let the quiet seep into his bones, let it settle behind his ribs where, for so long, only vigilance had lived. The kind of vigilance that turned front yards into battlefields, and silence into tactical awareness. But that chapter had closed, not with shouting, not with fists, but with undeniable, unshakable truth. From inside the house, Devin's voice floated through the window, on the phone, likely fielding another invite from some network looking for a tell-all interview. They'd turned them all down, not because there wasn't a story to tell, but because the story had already been lived. Loudly. Publicly. Enough. Shaq's gaze drifted toward the house across the street again. This time he wasn't measuring threat. He was witnessing legacy. You win, he said softly, when you don't have to fight anymore. That sentence had taken months to settle into language. He'd tried others, something about dignity, or perseverance, or power reclaimed, but none of them stuck the way this one did. You win when you don't have to fight anymore. Not because the fight wasn't necessary, not because the rage wasn't real, but because the fight wasn't the goal. The peace afterward was. And today, this porch, this street, that family, it all pointed to something rare in stories like this. Transformation that didn't end at headlines. The sun dipped low, scattering gold across the rooftops, and one by one, porch lights flickered on. Devin stepped outside, 2 glasses of sweet tea in hand. He handed one over, no words needed. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the light settle like a blanket over the block. "What are you thinking about?" Devin asked eventually. Shaq exhaled. "That house. That door. That welcome. You think they'll be okay?" Shaq took a sip, then nodded slowly. "They'll be more than okay," he said. "They'll write their own story." He didn't need to finish the thought. Didn't need to say that this time, the neighborhood would be forced to listen. Curtains still shifted, but now they revealed more than fear. They revealed curiosity, maybe even reflection. A woman from 2 doors down waved briefly. A man across the street nodded. The temperature of the place had changed, not overnight, not painlessly, but undeniably. A small voice echoed from the driveway across the street. "Mom, this is the coolest house ever." And in that moment, Shaq smiled for real. Not because he had won, not because someone else had lost, but because the house that had once tried to define him now held joy loud enough to echo. He leaned back, the porch light casting a soft glow on the step beside him. Nothing about the house had moved, but everything about it had changed. Legacy wasn't in the verdict. It was in the welcome. It was in the laughter. It was in the fact that no one needed to shout anymore. It was in the quiet. And for the first time in a very long time, that quiet felt like peace. Real peace. At last. If this story moved you, don't scroll past. Real stories like this one deserve more than silence. They deserve to be remembered, discussed, and shared. What happens when truth stands its ground? You just saw it. Stick with us. The next story might hit even closer to home.